Welcome back to PLS 510. Today I'd like to go over the topic of weeds and forage management. I'm going to be pulling a lot of material from a couple of publications, and I'll introduce the second one later, but the first one I want to make you aware of is AGR 172, and this one is Weed Management and Grass Pastures, Hayfields, and Other Farmstead Sites by J.D. Green, Bill Witt, and Jim Martin. First point I want to make is that weed control is not just spray and pray. There are a lot of methods and we should use them all. The first I'll call out are biological methods, and perhaps one of the most successful was the introduction of the thistlehead weevil that attacks the seed head or the flowering part of musk thistle. Cultural, the second one, is probably the one that we ought to go to first. For example, I'll just go to the third one right off the bat, that soil fertility practices to thicken up the existing stand might be the best place to start. And I'm going to remind you about the Broomsedge study in Powell County, but certainly thickening up what you already have is the best place to start. We may need to replant before we do it for you. In other words, you kill a weed, then you may need to replant. Or if you're following up a crop and you've got bare soil, go ahead and replant before you begin to raise a crop of weeds. Use weed-free seed, and that just means use good quality seed. You don't want to introduce weeds that are a problem. I already mentioned soil fertility, and of course grazing practices matter. And we usually target this grazing practice to be weed control, to be targeted at not overgrazing. But it may be using small ruminants who will then selectively graze browse and forbs that may not be as desirable in a stand, for example, ironweed and others. And of course, mowing is also an option. Sometimes we use mowing as a prelude to spraying because it will make the plant be vegetative, and that makes them usually more able to be controlled by herbicide. And of course, the one we think of perhaps most frequently when you talk about weed control is the chemical option. I want you to be aware of the type of sprayers that are available because it can also give us more herbicide options. And from the upper left, that's a rope wick sprayer, mounted on a four-wheeler that you're able then to adjust the height. The one on the right, upper right, is a boomless sprayer. You can see it creates quite a pattern of herbicide. And the one in the bottom center is the traditional boom type sprayer. The rope wick sprayer sometimes can be useful. It depends on weed contact with the wick and that it transfers enough of the herbicide onto the weed to be active. The herbicide is actually in the boom, and the rope wick then will be wet with the herbicide and can then wipe that herbicide on the weed. There needs to be a height differential. This does let us use sometimes a non-selective herbicide in a field where we wouldn't have any other options. For example, Johnson grass in a field of other grass. You might be able to use the rope wick applicator to get herbicide, Roundup, for example, on the Johnson grass and where you could not spray it broadcast. Boomless sprayers are very helpful in forage situations because we're often found needing to spray fence rows or rougher terrain where having a boom would not be as useful. When you have a long boom in a field with a lot of slope and a lot of rougher terrain, then the bounce and the makes it difficult to use. So boomless sprayers are becoming quite popular for spraying a lot of our forage fields. And then, of course, you've got the traditional boom sprayers that are accurate and certainly are an option as well. But because these type of sprayer or applicator that you use does impinge on what kind of herbicide choices you have, wanted to make you aware of these three types. Now I'd like to remind you of that study in Powell County that was broom sedge and was low in potash that we then went in and did a fertilizer study. This happens to be an aerial photograph on the April 16th of this year of that study. And if you take a look, the replications run left to right. There are 4 of those separated by alleys. The red box in this first replication, these are all treatments that have some nitrogen applied and with differing amounts of other nutrients. This happens to be triple 19, 200 pounds, so it's just a very little bit of NP and K. This very, very dark one that you can see here and here and here, and actually it's here as well, happens to be the nitrogen plus phosphorus but no potassium. It winds up being 100% bluegrass, whereas in these other, like down below those two, the next 2 plots are nitrogen plus either nitrogen plus potassium. There's nitrogen and potassium in those next 2, and they are almost 100% tall fescue, at least the visible species that you can see looking down on them. On the no fertilizer controls are in the orange boxes. So these right now on April 16th, even though we're greening up a little bit between the crowns of broom sedge, you can see that the brown or tan crowns of broom sedge dominate those plots. So here in this case, you would have very little option to spray herbicides or very little herbicide option to control the broom sedge. But when we would thicken up the other forages that it's growing with, then we were able to shift this without having to use a herbicide, simply using fertilizer. Another view of this is last spring, a couple of plots side by side that really show the difference between no fertilizer and the treatment that had plus nitrogen and plus a lot of potash. Let's take a look at some costs and talk about that for just a second. Now, there are several common herbicides are over here. I need to make you aware that Forefront R plus P is the old name of Grazon Next, which is one of the most popular, I'd say, new family of herbicides for broadleaf control in grasses. But if you look at the prices, this is the estimated cost per acre. It does not include the use of spray additives or the cost for application. This would be just product cost. And we've got several options compared to mowing at the bottom. And the point I want to make is that herbicide options can be very low cost, comparable to mowing in many instances. Now, one of the quandaries in pasture work or forages is that when you need to control a broadleaf in a grass clover pasture, I used to have to say that there was no selective herbicide option available that did not injure clover. Now, that has changed. Starting this year, the announcement has been made about the name of the new product that Corteva, the old Dow AgriScience, has. It's a broadleaf herbicide that will not kill clover, and it is called Proclova. So I don't think we've got that much commercial experience yet with this herbicide, but we have tried it and tested it in Kentucky before, and we have, a lot of high hopes for this product because that is one of the hardest decisions to make, and I'll talk about that a little more later. Do I spray herbicide to kill broadleaf weeds if I'm going to kill out my clover at the same time? It may not be necessary with Proclova. So what is that clover dilemma? So broadleaf materials will injure or kill clover, any of them except for Proclova. Of course, UK is looking at something at UK is looking at a 2,4-D tolerant red clover, plus Corteva Dow AgriScience it's now not experimental anymore. It's Proclova. It's out. But here's something I want to remind you of, and if this is not certainly one of those facts you carry from this class before today, lock this one in. We need 25% by weight clover in the stand, and the clover needs to be high yielding to get the nitrogen and yield benefit that would warrant not spraying. And you could add to that sentence, not applying nitrogen. So if you've got a really substantial clover stand, then yes, you can hold up on spraying a over-the-top herbicide like that will like 2,4-D that will take it out. Of course, Proclova is an option. But the reason why I left this in here is because that middle bullet, that statement about needing 25% by weight clover, and the clover needs to be high yielding to get the nitrogen and yield benefit, is really crucial. It is one of those facts that you need to remember going forward no matter what. And of course, it depends on the weed, whether you should spray or not, and how costly, how problematic it is. In some cases, you need to spray the weed, even if you don't have Proclova and you're going to lose your clover. Realize that when you kill the clover, that nitrogen is going to be released immediately into the stand, so you'll get a nitrogen benefit released at least that year into the stand. You'll get that nitrogen benefit. Of course, you'll have to add clover back, but that's not that difficult. Another concept or consideration whenever you're choosing a herbicide for different operations is that herbicides have waiting intervals before grazing, making hay, or slaughter. And if you look at this table 3 from AGR 172, list of herbicides on the left. One of the most sensitive animals when you're going to graze, of course, are the lactating dairy cows, because what goes in their mouth this morning is in the milk tank that afternoon. So you can see that herbicide choices in a grazing operation need a lot more thought in order to abide by these waiting intervals. When you look at the waiting intervals for grazing for beef or other animals, there's very little in the way of waiting interval. You can confuse yourself or get confused if you look at a product that's now generic, like 2,4-D. You can find some labels that say no waiting period, some that say 7 days, and it's mainly because the companies or the formulator is trying to be conservative. Certainly, we know 2,4-D does not cause problems, but sometimes we are concerned that whatever weed it kills may enter a toxic phase right after spraying. So that is the rationale for waiting 7 days. And many times, particularly in high-value horse markets, it would be very common for the farm to pull off the horses off the field after spraying for a period of time to allow for that for the weeds that have been affected to die. When you're going to harvest the animals, then you're going to pick up a few more restrictions, and hay harvest has a few more yet. So be aware that herbicides have waiting intervals before you graze them, hay them, or harvest the animals from them. Now, I want to change gears just a little bit and make the point that just killing weeds is not enough, and I want to ask you why. So think about that for just a second. Why is killing weeds not enough? And this picture in front of you should give you the clue to the answer, because if we kill the weeds that come after this muddy mess, what do we have left? Bare ground. So a herbicide plan, in my mind, must have a reseeding plan. Now, and if we don't reseed, we've got to at least have a way to thicken up the forage to fill the holes that the weed leaves. So in general, a herbicide plan must have a reseeding plan.